So the first section I had is the prisoners' rights revolution. Prior to the 1960s, the courts had a hands-off policy when it came to taking prisoner lawsuits. I find that very interesting, that the courts wouldn't take on these such issues that involve inhumane punishments, not giving them health care, or just basic things like that. So I find it very odd that the courts wouldn't take such cases prior to the 1960s. After the 1960s, though, there were some challenges that went through the court system, and by the late 1960s, early 1970s, the courts finally decided to start taking prisoner cases. Well, of course, that obviously increased their workload, but some of the early 1970s cases are on male censorship and freedom of religion, and a 1972 case that allowed prisoners to sue for damages that resulted in disciplinary actions by the prison. But of course, once the courts decided to start taking these cases, their caseload went through the moon, because we do incarcerate a lot of prisoners, and the courts have to now sift through all that information and figure out which case is legit, which is not, which do we need to look at now, which can we look at later. So that would be the first section I had. The second section are changes in prison. There was a limitation, which is basically taking a suit to the courts, and that was one of the major changes. Now, since the prisoners could sue or could seek damages for getting hurt, this brought a lot of stuff to the prisoners. It gave them more freedom that prior to 1960 they did not have. They had a lot of just issues in the beginning with this, especially just trying to get these basic rights. It took a lot of court cases and a lot of court listening for these prisoners to gain these rights. And now we'll be kind of explaining the judiciary outcome. There's 4 of them. Constraints and conditions. You have to have, with prison reform, the court has to look at the conditions of the case and the constraints of said case. It says in the book that when they do nothing or oppose court decisions, a little change occurs. This is in reference to the prisons. So you're asking the court, even if the court makes a case, it gets passed, you have to rely on the prison now to follow said order by the court. And this time, another implication is lack of implementation of power. Again, this kind of goes back to the courts saying something and then them relying on the bailiffs and the guards to implement these policies that are changing. But of course, we all need good old politicians. We need to and this is how prisons kind of work. You scratch their back, they scratch yours. Prisons today are deeply underfunded still. Some just are not good, and they're overcrowded, and they need money to operate. So these politicians need to give money to the prison in order for them to operate. Well, now you're involving kind of like the judicial side and the legislative side. And when you involve these two together, things don't turn out so well, because now you're involving 2 of the 3 powers of government, and that's not a good thing, considering the government can't even run the subway system. And then there's a quote in here about Indiana. And in Indiana Attorney General, when it came for judges ruling, if the judge issued a narrow dealing, like with Medicare and overcrowding, the state felt like they were going to comply with it however they could, but they need like funds and people to map this out. Then a second ruling, if the judge details every little step that involves the court, involves the prison, from upper management to the guards, here's what you need to do. Here are this many people that need to provide medical attention, et cetera, then it's more easily followed because the judge detailed and outlined, this is what this is. And then last but not least is juvenile court. Juvenile court, in 1967, there was a case, Galt, where he was 15 years old and he wasn't given his rights. Right to attorney, right to speech and all that. But the kid wasn't given his basic rights. Rights to an attorney, rights to why he's being called into court. And he's 15. And the point at this time was juvenile court. You got incarcerated and it was meant to fix you, kind of like rehab, and then get you back out. But if he'd been an adult, this would have been a $50 fine. So I don't know why the courts are biased, I guess, when it comes to juveniles, thinking that maybe they can change by the time they're, like 21 or not. So I find that very kind of concerning in the early parts of this, that the courts would let juveniles just, you got charged, you're going to almost like a rehab, but that rehab may or may not help you, and you might do the same thing when you get to adult court, but adult court has a lesser sentence. So I find that very confusing when it comes to judicial actions when this occurred. And in the book, this is directly from the book, similarly in 6 state studies, in the 6-state study based on a 1984 data, found that nearly after 20 years after this case, where this juvenile really wasn't given rights per se when he was arrested, found that nearly half of the jurisdictions in the study still didn't follow this rule 20 years later. That's very concerning, considering these are young kids. They don't know a lot about courts and about law. I would love to kind of see the data today and see if the actual counties are involved or actually given the rights to these kids. I would hope that given with social media nowadays and media in general, that these kids should be able to receive a lawyer and a reason why, explaining this is why you're getting incarcerated. And that's my section, really, so far. Next up section is going to be the exclusionary rule.